seated, and hopefully you'll all have a little patience with me because we are technically, I'm coming to you live, but this is a little bit of a challenge today, so bear with me. We've been studying the lost tribes of Israel for at least, I think, the last 10 or 11 weeks, laying a foundation that I'm hoping to fill in some of the gaps and give you some answers to some of the most challenging questions. I've already stated why this subject is of great importance. We have been looking at different people, the Sakasuni, the Beit Kumri, the Masagetai, the Sakasithians, to get an idea of how far these people moved and migrated. But I want to remind all of my listening audience, as I had a conversation last week with someone who tuned in as a new listener and said, wow, this is more like a globe-trekking type teaching. And I said, no, this is actually explaining the unfolding of a lot of other things biblically that we may or may not have the answers to, but this takes us somewhere. This isn't just a journey on going to different places on the globe to talk about how people got there. I'm going to keep reminding my audience that we have a difference between the house of Judah, that is the southern kingdom, versus Israel, the northern kingdom, Ephraim. So we've only scratched the surface on the northern kingdom, and we started looking at the biblical tribe of Dan. We know other contributors like the Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, and a few other people we have to investigate. But last week I spent some time lining up the biblical Dan, and perhaps I think the biggest takeaway that was probably the greatest revelation was that we see only one son in the genealogies mentioned, Hushim. So it is very safe to conclude that they had a lot of daughters, very few sons, and this is how they got to that populous number. And then, of course, the other noteworthy thing is, I said, the fact that we'll see tribe of Judah and tribe of Dan kind of intertwined and trailing each other at times, but this again will become important later on as we start putting all the pieces together. So there is a lot of paving the way for other tribes that then will end up in lands that perhaps were already established by, for example, the tribe of Dan. We studied the Greek Danoi, the Egyptian records of the Danuna, the Turkish records as well that chronicle these people, and the biblical Dan. We can safely assume these are all the same people, and some of these, as I said, are probably before the children of Israel go into Egypt's bondage. So we began tracing the departures by sea. We know that the people left the Levant. They arrived in Greece, setting in the Argolid. And there, that place, essentially where they land, will take on, the whole area will take on their name, Danoi or Danas. Even some of their customs that would be enforced on emerging populace. And there's a lot of other interesting reasons to investigate this. For example, there are other people that we, if we were studying this history in greater detail, are referred to as Doric. And the Doric colonies in Crete took place in the third generation after the Dorian acquisition of the Peloponnesus. And why this is so important is if you go to a map of the Holy Land, and if you look basically eye-line where biblical Megiddo is, and draw a line straight to the coast, you're going to see the biblical land, Dor, D-O-R, and there's good reason to believe that these people, Doric, are from the land of Dor. So we start piecing together a lot of information. The Spartans, for example, amalgamated with the Ionic, Aeolic, and the Danites. So we're starting to see a blend of people. And the Doric and Spartans formed government that has some very strange resemblance to Israel's structure, the way they might have conducted themselves. What we're talking about, government in antiquity, not modern Israel, of course. The other thing that we have that is incredibly interesting is that between 750 BC and 600, diverse groups, colonies are popping up. And here's the real issue. None of these people have a solid historical background. They just suddenly appear in the area, and there's enough breadcrumbs to show that these people all came from the general area, we'll say leaving from the Levant and arriving in that general area, Greece and the islands that make up that area. We also have good reason to believe that there were good relations between the Spartan Greeks and the quote-unquote Jewish community, because in the Antiquities of the Jews, we read Jonathan, the high priest of the Jewish nation, to the Ephori and Senate and the people of the Lacedaemonians send greeting. And this is something that's chronicled by Josephus. This is a quote. When in former times an epistle was brought to Onias, who was then our high priest, concerning the kindred that was between us and you, a copy which is here subjoined, we both joyfully received the epistle because we were well satisfied about it from the sacred writings. They are claiming kindred or kinship with one another, both the Greeks and these of the synagogue. So we definitely have a connection. There is no question. There's enough information to show that in antiquity, if we're looking at who's who, it seems all these people just appear in this general area at about the same time and then suddenly start realizing in their communications they are related. There is kinship there. So we have a very clear pathway when we're tracing the tribe of Dan. I have speculated, along with others, that possibly Spartans may even make up some part of the tribe of Simeon. We'll see if we can substantiate that, but that's not my subject today. We also know that because of what the Bible describes, Dan leaves behind a trail of their namesake, both land and sea. So if we're looking to the area beyond the Black Sea, which in antiquity used to be called Ister or the Borysthenes, that becomes the Danube and the Don, we definitely see the evidence of these people having migrated. And this is not just one incident, but multiple waves, and as I said, archaeology that backs this up as well. The Danites, or the tribe of Dan, or as we will come to know and refer to them equally as the Tuatha de Danann, would establish themselves for approximately 2 centuries. We looked at last week in the area that we are calling Ireland before the arrival of the Judah line, the Malaysians, who will not only have a long line of kings and queens that will rule Europe, but from these people we will also learn the origins of Gaelic. And I'll come back to that possibly in a bit. There's just a lot of information here. Like I said, unfortunately, I can't see you, so I can't see if, a lot of times I'm able to see if people are understanding just by the looks on your face. I can't see anything, so we'll have to do a little bit of review next week on this, but hopefully this is all abundantly clear. Denmark at one time controlled the greater area which bore the name of the Scandinavian peninsula. The Danes claimed that they were descendants from the great Dan, meaning Dan of the tribe of Dan. The evidence of these people is found abundantly, as I said, if you look from the places Dundrum, Donegal, the bay that leaves signposts everywhere. Dudo, who wrote sometime around 1000 AD, he said Daci, or the Daci, are by their own called Danoi or Dani, and commend themselves as hailing from the Antenor after the destruction of Troy. So there's this strange thing said that I want to pick up now to kind of start piecing these people together. You know, we talk about the tribe of Dan and the Danes and the people of Denmark. We talk about the people of Scandinavia. So there's something that will begin to tie these people together in terms of a word we're going to encounter a lot, which is the term Viking. Now, you not think this is the strangest way to get to this understanding of this word, but if you remember, in the book of Judges, it said regarding Dan, why did Dan remain in ships? But equally strange, if you keep reading, there's something said about Asher. It says that Asher continued on the shores and abode in his breaches. And breaches meaning landing place or inlet. The Hebrew word for this breaches is mifratz. Here's a wild connection to something. See if you can make the jump with me. I actually sent an image of a Swedish Bible, and you'll be looking at, if the director can put it up, it is Judges 5:17 onward. And I only want, you don't need to read the language to be able to see the word vikar. So where they translate the word for breaches, vikar, that is in the Swedish Bible, 1878, I believe. There is a linguistic connection to the word Viking. Let's look at the etymology for clues. The word Viking is a historian's revival word. It was not used in Middle English, but it was reintroduced from Old Norse, Vikingur, a freebooter, sea rover, pirate, Viking, and it says equally one who came from the fjords, from the word vik, creek, inlet, small bay. So we could easily hypothesize that Asher was part of this seafaring Danite group early on. The translation of when it says, why did he, that Asher continued on the shores and abode in his breaches, the landing place or the inlet kind of gives you the imagery that these people were Dan, Asher, and others perhaps teamed up already, making part of this seafaring group. So keep that connection, because when we come back to looking at the Vikings in a more in-depth approach, this will become key to see the linguistic and the etymological connections that I'm making today. There was an Icelandic historian named Snorre Sturluson. He lived 1179 to 1241 and wrote the Heimskringla, where he described areas settled north and south of the Caucasus Mountains of a Nordic and Germanic people, these called Asser and Vanner, or Asher and Dan. Now, this is what he says. On the south side of the mountains, which lie outside of all inhabited lands, runs a river through Swiftiod, which is properly called Tanis, formerly called Vanaquissil or Vanaland. The Vanner and the Asser live close together, their chief being known as Odin. Now, this might not make sense to you, but the country east of what this writer is calling Vanaquissil in Asia, called Asaland, and the chief city of Asgard, they are making the connection back to the city of Troy. And if you go to those ancient records, it's very clear that that is the connection being made. Now, remember I pointed out to you, biblical Troy would be founded by the line of Judah, not the line of Dan. So it's interesting that they're tracing that back to Troy. The other things that have a parallel here with these folks being described as Germanic peoples, they had a temple with 12 priests to direct their sacrifice as well as to act and render judgment. So if you don't think there's some type of strange, we'll call it a vestigial remnant, some type of twisted in the background memory of some of their practices, although they're all completely into Baal worship and into pagan worship, but there are some trace memories that take us back to practices that were originally done amongst these original tribes. The other thing, too, is we're going to encounter, these are all concepts I'm introducing today, which I have to elaborate on, but we'll read about several Odins. Most people have heard about the mythological leaders, the Odins, the first Odin, second, and third. According to Britannica Online, Odin was also Woden, Woden, or Wotan, and the Roman historian Tacitus stated that the Teutons worshipped Mercury because Deus Mercury, Mercury's day is Wednesday, identified with Woden's or Odin. So there's all these very interesting connections we'll see to days of the week, the type of worship that they practice. But let me stop here to kind of take a slight sidebar and explain something. The reason why all of this becomes fascinating is we see, for example, Dan and many of the offshoots of Dan, specifically later the Vikings who will wear the horned helmets. This imagery is part of, we'll call it the calf or the cow or the Baal worship that was carried with them from when they set up those idols at Dan and Bethel. So we can almost see false religion being spread at the hands of people who were originally chosen for worshiping the one true God. And this connection will actually help us to understand how eventually the tribe of Ephraim, whose symbol is bull or calf-like as well, what the connection will be. And I need to kind of explain maybe a little bit more. As we have been watching all of these people migrate, the big question is if the tribe of Dan and the tribe of Judah settle a lot of these territories we've covered very briefly, how does Ephraim and Manasseh, usually interpreted by most Bible scholars as England and the USA, how do they fit in if the tribe of Dan has established the areas we're looking at, Ireland, some parts of Scotland, and if the tribe of Judah has established its lineage both in what will become England, and elsewhere? How do we get to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh becoming these company of nations then? And this is why laying down this pathway, which is a little bit complicated without being able to show you anything, at least gives the insight that there will be a convergence of people, another wave of people that will spread, and we will begin to kind of make sense of how these people, all of these people, cover the face of the earth, which goes back to what God had said to Abraham, your seed as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand of the sea. So, what we have are two distinct groups that have appeared, as I said, one by land, one by sea, but the Nordic tribes, consisting of Danes, Norwegians, and then another group of Germanic tribes surface, and they are led by a mere mortal whose name is Odin, not some mythological god. And Odin is said to have been the first king of Scandinavia. Now, if you start trying to look this up, this is where it gets interesting because there's a lot of, again, mythology meets some kernels of truth which we will have to sort out. But for right now, I can tell you the record says that this Odin, first king of Scandinavia, lived and died sometime between 70 BC and 50 BC. And where it gets even more interesting is the oldest Nordic sources tell us that, as I alluded to earlier, the land formerly ruled by Odin, called Asgard, is none other than Troy. So if you keep digging, you find that there are all these interconnections that take you somehow back to Greece, and before that somehow back to Troy, and before that somehow back to Egypt and or Canaan. So there's no escaping this. The other thing is that Odin supposedly led a migration out of a land begetting many sons and daughters. There's all these parallels. There's also the interpretation of Thor being a parallel to the biblical Moses. So, as I said, when you start looking, it becomes important to examine all this information. And I'm going to jump ahead and say why. Once we see, for example, we get to the time of Christ, and Christ will basically tell his disciples to basically go not in the way of the Gentiles, but to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's very interesting to see how Jesus' disciples, if you look at them, and perhaps the tribes that they herald from, where God maybe did have a purpose to go back and revisit those lands with the very people that had the greatest potential to be able to communicate and convey the good news of the gospel. But if we're looking ahead at the very end of time, it may give us the insight as to why Dan is not numbered amongst those in the book of Revelation. And if you start investigating, maybe a little homework for the folks at home to look up the disciples of Christ, his first circle of people, and you see where they are from, what tribes they may have come from, and why is this important? Because if we look at, for example, Peter, who will become the association of the church at Rome, that goes off into its own realm, a different type of faith, not the faith that was originally preached by Christ. You've got the church being run in Jerusalem by Jesus' half-brother James, and again, it goes off the rails. So we might actually be able to determine that Dan is not single in its plunging into pagan worship, and that perhaps we might understand the passages in the book of Revelation that describe a lot of false worship, those who claim they are of a faith that are not, and so forth. All this probably begins to start to make sense when we see the spread of Christianity, who accepted it, and who rejected it. But as I said, I'm laying down lots of big pieces today, so you may not be connecting all the dots, but I promise you we will do a review, and my goal is to make sure that this is as clear as possible, especially when we start looking at these tribal people. As I said, Denmark, the Danes' borderland was originally three parts: Scania, Jutland, and the Isles. And if you start tracing the Danish history, very interesting, you can actually start at a fixed point in the 930s AD, which we have good absolute records for, and then you keep going back, and you can trace this record actually further back than most. The Danish people were very inclined to leave good records. The Jutes, on the other hand, were a Germanic tribe, and they became Nordic after a time. So we have the Jutes becoming part of Denmark in about 235 AD. And the Saxons, which were the largest Germanic tribe, well, actually, Jutes and Saxons are tied, but they settled into an area which is Lower Saxony and the North Rhine, and we see a very interesting picture emerges. So, for example, the earliest authentic mention of the Saxons is recorded by, of all people, Ptolemy, the Alexandrian. Sharon Turner, in his history, says, by the passages in his geography and by the concurrence of all their future history, it is ascertained that before the year 141 after Christ, there was a people called Saxons who inhabited a territory at the north side of the Elbe on the neck of the Cimbric, 3 small islands at the mouth of this river. So that is the beginning of the Saxon history. And most people, including myself, make the connection to the Saxons being part of a group of people we've already looked at, the sons of Isaac, the Sakasuni, Saxons. So we have different groups emerging. The one thing that I am not going to take a stand on, a lot of people have written that the Jutes, seemingly some people believe, are part of the tribe of Judah, but I think that's too convenient a nomenclature to put on these people. Actually, and I always tell you my opinion is the Jutes are none other than the Getai, another group of people we've previously encountered. They will settle in, the Jutes will, in Kent, the Isle of Wight, and these people will all start to blend together. But if you're looking for the history, the Jutes were invited to Britain by a person of high rank named Vortigern to aid him in defeating the Picts. So the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes began settling in the land. The Angles formed Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. And these become important places in the development of the Christian faith, the spread and development of the Christian faith. The Saxons, or the sons of Sakai, formed Essex and Wessex. That left the Jutes in the Hampshire, Kent, and, as I said, the Isle of Wight. The history of these people also kind of fills in the blank. There are good records for the life of King Alfred by one Bishop Asser, who is the oldest known source on the Anglo-Saxons. This material sits in the British Library to this day. If you're interested, you should look it up online. It's a pretty fascinating document, but it gives a glimpse into the life of not just the king, but everything leading up to his reign, and something very interesting that is chronicled within this writing, and I'll read it to you. It says, King Alfred was the son of King Ethelwulf, who was the son of Egbert, who was the son of Elmund, who was the son of Eopao, who was the son of Inglid. Inglid, I believe, is the attachment to where we actually get our word for English eventually. But Inglid and Ina were two famous West Saxon kings who were also brothers. And if you keep reading this lineage from the British Library's manuscript, they trace their lineage all the way back to Shem, to biblical Noah. And that's pretty fascinating that someone would chronicle and document that way. The Anglo part, or the Inglid or Anglo, as I said, the symbol of the bull is part of Ephraim's animal representation, if you will, if you go back to the Bible. So I think we're going to start to see the connection. If somebody's saying, well, where does the tribe of Ephraim fit in it? Where does Manasseh fit in? We will keep seeing these people in different ways, and it is like a perfect blend. So as we begin to see these people populate this area, we also have the history become clearer and clearer. And as for this English part, the Anglo-Saxon part, it is very well documented. So when somebody says, well, we don't have good records or we don't have great information, we do. And this information leads us all the way back once more to those who trace their lines back to either the sons of Sakai, the sons of Isaac, the Saxons, equally the Jutes, and I am leaning heavily that the Jutes are Getae, and this is not part of the tribe of Judah, and I will give my reason for that probably in a future message. But all of these people, as I said, very, very clear, will make up an important part of the history and the development, the transmission of both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we'll call it the ultimate corruption as well. If you look and you start to investigate, as I said, the people who were sent out to spread the message, the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, go into every nation, make learners, make disciples. And that did start happening, but very early on you begin to see the corruption that creeps into what was the Catholic Church. Early on you begin to see the corruption that was going to be nothing but a splinter group of Judaism. The church at Jerusalem would have been that way. And eventually these two will meld together to make the greatest consortium of false worship with customs and traditions that never belonged in the Bible, were never a part of God's way, but definitely we can see where all of these practices came from. So the reason for following this long trail of people, and we'll follow the development, for example, of those who landed in Britain, is to understand that these countries at their foundation would be ruled by the prophecy that is explained about Judah, the right to rule, the right to make the law. And if we really look carefully, we even see right to the time of the Protestant Reformation which country will give birth to stripping away some of the, we'll call it, pagan worship that has just for hundreds of years been grafted onto the church, and seemingly we can't stop this. So this is part of tracing, part of the work of tracing these people is also to see where these things crept in, how they got grafted on, and then to make sense of certain other biblical texts. For example, when Paul writes in Galatians and he says there is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, and he uses the term Scythian or barbarian. And we can see that these terms are meant specifically for a reason. So even in the day when Paul was writing, there's good reason to believe that there was knowledge of these people who are not lost. Peter, in opening his book, writing to those who have been dispersed, scattered, we have enough information to see that these people who disappear from one place on the map and reappear in another with very similar customs, they no longer know their correct practices. They've grafted themselves completely and submersed themselves completely in pagan worship. So the big question on all of this is, how does this all come full circle? And I believe the answer is tied up in the fact that as we see, not one group of people in all of this mysterious moving and migrating will actually keep their proper customs and traditions. And we're probably going to encounter more people as the weeks go on. As I said, the Vikings are just one in many who will not know who they are, who will be warrior-like people, nomadic people, appear, and then just as they appeared, they disappear once more. So tracing these people is no easy feat, and I realize that, again, I'm probably putting a lot of information on you, but hopefully next week, if I can be there with you, I can show you on a map the development of how important to understand when the gospel will eventually reach these shores, which is actually much earlier. It's attributed to a much earlier time. And the people who we are tracing will actually turn and attack, viciously attack. For example, I'm sure most of you have heard of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And it will be the Vikings who will raid Lindisfarne, taking a lot of the treasures that were in that monastery, attacking their own people that they don't even realize are their own people. We're going to see a lot of this, and this becomes important in the history and the development and the understanding, not just for prophecy being fulfilled, but also, as I said, for a future time when we begin to see how in the last days God maybe had all this lined out so that we might look and see the punishment, if you will, meted out on the earth is after a time where maybe God just said, I've had enough. I gave the opportunity for my children to know the truth. I gave the opportunity for them to hear and be liberated, but they didn't hear, they didn't receive. And ultimately, we have the culmination of what happens in the book of Revelation to bring on the new heaven and the new earth. But I believe that God will still have one final call to the people of the earth who are still here. And this is why all of this information, when you start gathering it together, you realize God has been unfolding this drama of redemption over centuries. He is not finished. The history of these people that maybe at first seem barbaric, strange, and foreign, well, these may be the people ultimately that begin to herald and propagate the gospel and try to get the message, the right message, the uncorrupted message, back to the people who should receive it. But we're still not there, and we've got a long way to navigate in terms of unfolding all this. So I hope that you will join me next week. We will definitely be trying to navigate this in a much clearer format. But for right now, I'm going to leave you with the thought here, and that is that it seems like a big, tangled mess. But remember, I always use the image of a tapestry. The backside of it is full of those hanging threads, tangled up knots, but when you come around, you look at the front, you see the picture in its beauty, in its completion, and that's what this is. So maybe today we have looked at a lot of knots and rough ends, but as we begin to pull this together, I'm hoping that the front side of this tapestry begins to come into focus, that God's program, God's word, and God's prophecy all coming to pass, because God has put this as clear as in the Bible when Jesus says, go not to the Gentiles, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And we know that they are not lost, so it's just a question of keep declaring the message, and hopefully this message will be heard by ears previously closed and undesired to even receive. Perhaps God will open up the receiver today. But God willing, as I said, I'll be with you next week. I'm hoping that the bits and pieces I've dropped today are enough to start putting the bigger picture together. The lost tribes are not lost. God's plan is not lost. And there's still a lot more to unravel in this great unfolding redemption. But right now, and for today, that's my message.
I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.